vision in the quantity, the reach, and the breadth of cyber capacity building initiatives globally, focusing on different stakeholder groups, different themes, and different objectives. For example, in the formal and informal meetings of the Open-Ended Working Group at the United Nations, the importance of capacity building has been an area receiving near consensus support by states and non-state actors alike. And they have stressed that there is a need for more capacity building, while at the same time noting that capacity building needs to be guided by agreed principles such as reciprocity, sustainability, and effectiveness, and that we should use better use of existing structures and organizations to do so. And as this pandemic's exposure of our digital dependencies has only underscored this importance, they've said that we should redouble our efforts while at the same time doing more to ensure that capacity building is effective, it's respectful, and it's sustainable. Now, today we're going to be considering how greater interregional capacity building could put some of these principles into practice. How do different regions approach capacity building? How do different approaches, how can they be shared or better leveraged to embody this two-way street that we talk about in capacity building principles? Essentially, for the next hour, we're going to explore the benefits and the challenges of interregional capacity building, as well as concrete actions that could help different regions get the most out of it. Now, our four panelists bring a wealth of experience from different regions, but one of the exciting things about this is all of them have represented different stakeholder groups throughout their careers in governments and think tanks and regional organizations in the private sector and civil society. So they really have sat at different seats at the table, so to speak. So we're really going to get like double the benefit from our panel today. By way of housekeeping, we'll start with a discussion amongst the panelists, and then we'll open up to questions and insights from you, the participants. At any time, you can submit your questions and comments via the chat function. And when you do so, it'd be really great if you could share your region or your stakeholder group affiliation, because that's an important context for us in this conversation. And with that, I think I'm going to kick off with Lata Reddy, co-chair of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. Ms. Reddy has had a long and distinguished career in the Indian Foreign Service. She's the former Deputy National Security Advisor of India and has also served as Commissioner on the Global Commission on Internet Governance. Lata, like many of our panelists, you've been a different stakeholder at different points in your career. Now, based on your experiences, what do you see as the strength that Asia-Pacific governments and multi-stakeholder groups bring to cyber capacity building?
I'd say, Kirsten, that, first let me say how nice it is to be with all of you and to be talking on this global platform and to be talking in a multi-stakeholder group. As you said, I've had the opportunity to both work inside government and outside government. Just to set it in context, I'm from India, but I also have a global avatar, if I may use the word, which is that I've been on the Global Commission for Internet Governance and also on the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace as co-chair. So I think I can take both a broader view and a national view as well as a regional view. As you know, Asia Pacific is a very large area. We're divided into very many groups. And I think it's really done very well in the Asia Pacific so far as a region is ASEAN. You know, they have really come up well with capacity building initiatives. And I would suggest that every sub-region, if I may use the term, within the Asia Pacific could use that as a model. You know, the more advanced countries in terms of cyber capabilities within ASEAN, like Singapore and others, have really come forward to build centers of excellence, to take the lead, and yet at the same time, as you say, being very respectful and trying to introduce an element of reciprocity as well. This is always the trick with capacity building, you know. I mean, it shouldn't just be one person giving and the other person taking, whether between regions or between countries. Both must feel that they are contributing to the conversation and, in some way helping to build better capacity in their respective regions and between regions. Now, talking about South Asia, as you know, because of our geopolitical situation, the SARC has not been as effective as it could have been. But again, talking in a regional sense, India has been able to reach out to many of the smaller partners in South Asia, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and the Maldives, and try to help them build capacity. So there is also capacity building within regions, apart from between regions. And I would say some systems are working very well. For instance, CERTs are constantly in touch with each other. And when CERTs compare their experiences, it's very, very useful to as a learning process and as a strengthening process for how effective CERTs can be. Similarly, there's a setup between countries. And I think it'll have to be a mixture of bilateral, regional, sub-regional capacity building exercises truly effective. So I'll stop with that. And if there are any other points, we can come back to that later.
Thank you very much, Latha. And I think your point on respectful partnerships amongst neighbors in the same region is a really well taken. And I think it helps transition us to Folake Olagunyo's intervention. She's Program Officer of Internet and Cybersecurity at the Economic Community of West African States, the ECOWAS Commission. And she serves as co-chair of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise Advisory Board. Now, Folake, what do you see as the strengths of African regional or sub-regional organizations in capacity building?
Thank you very much, Kirsten, for the kind words, and also Latha, for what Latha has said is pretty much almost the same thing that we are doing. So it's always good to know that you're not doing anything completely different. So from our situation, in terms of cyber capacity building in West Africa, our region is still we're still trying to find our way. And that's sort of a good thing in the sense that we can actually now borrow from other regions and see what they have done instead of reinventing the wheel. But from a regional economic point of view, being the regional body, ECOWAS, what we're trying to do is establish relationships with donors so we can act as a bridge between our member states and the donors. Because if we do it that way, we're looking at economies of scale, economies of learning, and it's also a harmonized approach. What we're trying to say is within the region, we know it's somewhat different in developing countries as it is in developed countries. Our issues are somewhat different. So what we're trying to do is make sure within our region, like Latha rightly said, we want to do a little bit more South-South cooperation. So we've got a few key players within West Africa. You've got Nigeria, you've got Ghana, you've got Cote d'Ivoire, you've even got Cabo Verde, the smallest country in the region, but they're actively doing different things. So what we're trying to do is encourage the lesser member states that haven't gotten to that level to actually start engaging with individual member states. Aside from that, we've built relationships with donors such as the EU. So we're learning from them as well. So the EU is quite a good big brother or big sister, for the want of a better word, because they're also a regional bloc. We've seen what it is they're doing. And one of the ongoing partnerships we have is with the EU. We're also looking towards the African Union as the big sister of Africa to see what they have done and to see how other regions, SADC, COMESA, EAC, what they're also doing as well. So it's quite important that we don't over reinvent the wheel, for the want of a better word, because capacity building is capacity building. But what we want to do is ensure that whatever we actually build, it actually trickles down. So we want to make sure, and I'm going to use that word that nobody can really explain, sustainability. That's sustained capacity. So we want to make sure when we build a capacity, we're building it and people actually sustain it, and we keep building on that. So pretty much almost the same thing as Latha said is what we're doing. We haven't done anything completely different as yet.
Thank you, Folake. I'm really glad you brought up the definition of sustainability, that very amorphous, good sounding word, but what does it mean in practice? And perhaps we could circle back to that later in the conversation. I also, both of our first two speakers have mentioned the importance of regional or sub-regional organizations as being that bridge as helping to increase effectiveness, whether it's through matchmaking or serving as that bridge. And I think that's maybe something that we can also circle back to if people are interested. I sometimes wonder if we are investing enough in building capacity within regional and sub-regional organizations as a force multiplier to play that role. So maybe we could circle back to that if people are interested. Now, Liga Rosenthal, you're a Senior Director for the EU Cybersecurity and Emerging Threats at Microsoft and a former Latvian cyber diplomat at the EU and NATO. What do you see as the strengths of the private sector and regional arrangements in Europe in the field of cyber capacity building?
Good morning, Kirsten. Good morning, all panelists and all the participants. It's a pleasure to almost be in Katowice, as you could see behind me. Hopefully we'll meet all of here in this center next year at IGF in Poland. So thank you to the organizers for all their work in turning this event to digital, which is a bit unprecedented at this scale. As Kirsten mentioned, I've had a career in both government and the private sector. And so I think looking back, multi-stakeholder is sort of the theme of my CV. But I definitely speak from the perspective of Europe, where I have the best visibility of what the governments and private sector are doing. However, being a representative of Microsoft, I also have a strong visibility of how the global company is looking at these issues on advancing cyber norms, on looking at capacity building, and trying to find how we can work across regions as a global company. So looking at Europe itself, Europe has a slightly different arrangement on cybersecurity and capacity building, because in Europe, there's the EU that has a very strong legislative framework and cooperative framework that is very positive in some way. We have legislation that requires certain minimum levels of capacity across the EU, which is excellent, and also forms a lot of opportunities for cooperation across governments. However, moving from government to the private sector, I see that, the work among governments is excellent, but how to turn that into a multi-stakeholder process is slightly different. So there's sort of a two-track process: the multi-stakeholder process, which is a bit, which is sometimes in competition with the government processes. So how do we make that bridge to make the government processes more partnered with the multi-stakeholders of civil society and the private sector to take best advantage of all the resources, both regionally, and then how can Europe work with the rest of the world in this kind of format? Microsoft is very active in capacity building, and we're looking at the Paris Call as a tool to supplement processes going on by governments. As many of you know, the Paris Call addresses 9 different principles on building cybersecurity and through various cyber norms. But we want to go beyond that to see how we can actually implement these norms to work on capacity building. The UN efforts that are ongoing are excellent, and we support that as much as we can. And there are various initiatives looking at how the multi-stakeholder process can go forward. But I think it's very important to sort of share the lessons that we have across regions and compare also what are the differences, so we don't make assumptions about what works and what doesn't work. I think the 2 previous speakers have already identified how different areas differ. And I think that's excellent. I think that in Europe, there's an excellent government perspective on this with the EU cyber dialogues. I would be very interested to see if there's a multi-stakeholder process that could accompany the EU cyber dialogue and sort of build bridges. I was very pleased that there was a EU-India dialogue finally after many years of discussion. Perhaps looking ahead, we can see how there could be an EU-India sort of not track 2, but next day process with the multi-stakeholders engaged in this process. And we can see how that can be applied to different regions. So getting the understanding of how different regions our approach in capacity building is quite important. And I also wanted to highlight that one step we're taking on building this understanding is yesterday at the Paris Peace Forum, Microsoft and the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise announced that they would be having a new joint project on a new Africa program manager looking at implementation of the Paris call in Africa, so over the next year. So we're looking forward to that cooperation and looking at how that could supplement capacity building in Africa as a first step in the next year.
Thank you, Liga. And that was an exciting announcement yesterday for sure. And perhaps next year when we're having this conversation, we can be doing specific lessons learned from that experience. Now, lastly, we have Bart Helkovin. Bart, in your role, it's inevitable that you would be on this panel because your title even has cyber capacity building in it. So you're head of cyber capacity building at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's International Cyber Policy Center. And you've worked on cyber capacity building in the Asia Pacific with regional organizations such as ASEAN, as well as internationally. What do you see as the strengths of think tanks and academia in your region's cyber capacity building efforts?
Thanks, Kirsten, and good evening to all of you, fellow panelists and everyone listening in. Right as you mentioned, I'm working with a think tank based in Australia, and as my previous speakers also mentioned a bit of their background, my background is very much, let's say, at the nexus of international peace and security and development issues. Now, as our role as a think tank, I think it's obviously a bit different from the previous speakers who are either, let's say, working with a regional organization, with a big multinational, or with a national government. And obviously, we don't have those resources behind us to actually do and decide on capacity building issues. But what we can do and what we are doing is obviously to look at what's happening in domestically, but definitely also in our region. So provide a level of analysis, provide advice, review what's currently going on, and try to look at where are the gaps or the duplication, and what are the additional niches that governments, industry, or regional organizations could tap into. And one of the other things that I think that the think tanks like ours definitely play a role in is something that Liga just mentioned is organizing kind of track 1.5 dialogues, where we indeed bring government, private sector, and civil society organizations together in a bilateral, trilateral, or whatever lateral dialogue with other organizations. Now, one thing I'd just like to share, let's say, based on my experience working with cyber capacity building in this part of the world for the last couple of years, is that working from Australia, which has obviously been very active in cyber capacity building. There was even a dedicated cyber capacity building program with the Department of Foreign Affairs. But we're kind of looking at three very different kind of cyber capacity building conversations or dialogues in our region. There's obviously kind of internal capacity building within the country, but also with kind of similarly mature nations. But then, let's say on our eastern side, Australia, New Zealand, and two parts Singapore are also very engaged in the South Pacific, and there you have a completely different dynamic, I think, from conversations elsewhere, where it's much more about connectivity. How do we make sure that people are actually taking up the benefits of ICTs in a responsible manner? As I sometimes tend to say, they're not entering the internet of the late 1990s, but they enter in the internet of 2020, which is so substantially different. And for instance, in Southeast Asia, where the focus is far less on kind of security or regional security, but more on kind of the digital connectivity and how do we transform our economies as Industry 4.0 and future-proof for the economy. So you've got the very different kind of dialogues happening. And to pick up on one point, I think it's for let's say a cyber capacity building nation where it's often kind of we're looked at providing certain expertise. It's really hard to provide expertise, and I'm throwing in some catchwords, that is indeed sustainable and really makes sense in a very different local context. And I want to echo, I think, the point made at the start of the conversation, that capacity building is very much kind of a back and forth between multiple partners, I would say. But I don't see that really happening in practice. What I see happening in practice is obviously that lots of capacity building is offered, and that those kind of with their feet on the ground really get lost out of it and get a good feel for local context and what's required. But how that trickles through in actually programming, let's say at the policy level or at the higher level, I think that's a very big challenge. And I think we see that partly represented in some of the challenges that a GFCE is facing, but also other kind of regional capacity building centers that have been stood up here in the region, for instance, in Thailand and in Singapore. I'll leave that for now. And yeah, I'll leave that for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Bart. And I see that you brought up sustainability again, so I think we're definitely going to come back to that. I kind of like to scratch a little bit deeper on this idea. There seems to be, I mean, we're having a whole panel about this, an underlying assumption that more cross-regional sharing, that region-to-region sharing is either necessary or would be beneficial. So let's unpack that assumption. It's something that Unitair's worked on. In 2018, 2019, we did a series of meetings in cooperation with CSIS of Washington on exactly this, and specifically looking to see if there was appetite for more structured conversation between regional and sub-regional organizations. So maybe we could start with that and look at why do we think that cross-regional sharing is something to be pursued rather than just a simple interest or I mean, why interregional? Latha, do you want to take a first stab at that?
Yes, well, I think it comes from the fact that, cyber is essentially a borderless regime, right? So we can only be as strong as the weakest link. So it makes sense that it's not just being strong within your country, within your sub-region, or within your region. To really have a proper, open, secure, safe system, we must really cooperate between regions. So I would say that's the fundamental reason. The second point is it's a game of catch up, really, because there are some countries which are very advanced and have great cyber capacity building already in place, and there are many who don't. So unless we really reach out between regions, how are we going to bridge this gulf? Your problem is that the largest share of future users, and even now the largest share of users, don't necessarily come from the highly developed countries. The largest user of cyberspace today is China, followed by India. And whereas it's widely recognized that it's in North America, maybe the Five Eyes and EU, that you've got the strongest cyber capacity already installed. So how are you going to reconcile these two unless there's interregional cooperation? So that will be really my take on it. And I think that if you don't give the Global South a legitimate voice, when they are going to be providing most of the future users, and even today provide a very huge proportion of the users of the internet, you're going to have an inherently unjust system, which is really not correct. So I would welcome any and all efforts at bridging this gap, bridging the digital divide, connecting the unconnected, bringing in more inclusion. And I think it would be wonderful if every region could cooperate, in this. As I said earlier, even within the region, certainly the ones who have more advantages, who have more skills, should really take the lead within the region. And more importantly, the more developed regions need to really reach out in a big way, which is why I think it's very exciting on what Liga said about the announcement at the PPF yesterday, And that's really the sort of thing we should be looking for. And Liga, incidentally, you were talking about the EU-India cyber consultations. In a sense, that was a track 1.5 because, I was part of that. I actually chaired a panel because you had representatives from the EU, you had the ambassador of the EU to India. This was held in Delhi. And yet at the same time, you had private experts such as, I would venture to say, myself and other colleagues, academics. You had some private sector as well, and you had think tanks, whether it was the German Marshall Fund or the EU Institute of Strategic Studies or the ORF, who were the co-hosts. So that to me is a way to really build capacity between regions. In this particular case, it wasn't between two regions, it was between the EU and India, but the same model could be extended to interregional cooperation by establishing track 1.5 dialogues between regions. And I think that's very, very important. I saw that for myself when we had the ASEM, the ASEAN, the ASEAN +6 and the EU dialogue on many, many other issues. So I don't see why the same shouldn't be happening on cyber as well.
Thank you for that very concrete example. Liga, you mentioned in your initial intervention about how we check our assumptions when we're engaging in cooperative partnerships across regions. So could you say more about that and maybe why even the challenge of checking one's assumptions, how do you do that? And again, why is this so important, this cross-regional sharing?
Yeah, sure. Latha, thanks for the information about the EU-India dialogue, and it's quite positive to hear that there were non-governmental actors in that, and I certainly encourage the EU and other regional actors that have these type of dialogues to consider the private sector as an actor that could be supplement those processes. But back to the question about, excuse me, checking assumptions, I find that as being a global player, and being quite a force sometimes in global issues, a company such as Microsoft really needs to tread carefully when moving into the space that is a bit of on global governance issues. And we want to have a firm understanding of where we can really supplement and help other processes that are ongoing and how we can do that in a constructive manner and not derail some things that are going on at the UN and in other formats. Understanding how resources can be shared in a thoughtful and sustainable way is very important. And how we go about that has to be careful and has to have a lot of feedback from regional actors. I think whether I speak from the side of Europeans or from Microsoft, we sit in our own environment and we know it works in our own environment, and that doesn't necessarily translate across regions. So to be able to ask the right questions, I think is part of the first steps in approaching cross-regional dialogue, to be able to see really how resources can be matched, how we can, you mentioned this two-way street, how we can make that two-way street really work, and and how we can fit in as a global actor. We're a US-based company, but I would say that a lot of our actions on building sustainable development and working with the UN is a much more global process than just an American process or North American process. So how can we take part in these processes across regions as a global actor and connect the input we have on cybersecurity, looking at a global scale on a more regional, sub-regional scale, and how we can be useful in this process without making assumptions.
Thank you, Liga. Maybe we could pivot to circle back to something that Bart has mentioned, and maybe this would be a good place for him to come back in. In your experience, to what extent can good practices from one region be applied to others? I mean, you've had the experience of working both within the Asia Pacific, but also on your international, your projects that have a more global focus. Where in your work have you seen or wished to have seen greater cross-regional sharing, or you felt there was a real opportunity that was being missed, either for lack of capacity or lack of sustainability, lack of resources? Could you say some words about that, Bart?
Sure, by all means. And it's actually one of the points I would be keen to follow up on, because I might want to take a bit of a different approach, because I'm not so sure whether kind of capacity building, let's say from one region to another region, or let's say that relationship is as productive as we sometimes want to think. And I think it's precisely, I think, what Liga just mentioned. And I'm coming, let's say for the moment, let's say from a Pacific perspective, where there is no strong regional organization. So there's no body which kind of either coordinates or is really kind of helping nations with articulating what they really need based in a local context, or what makes sense in a local context. So, for instance, an Australian solution or a Microsoft solution in the Pacific, I think would make, in 9 out of 10 cases, not really make sense. Even our lessons learned will probably be very difficult to apply in a totally different socio-economic setting, and also in a totally different kind of governance setting. So I think that's really important, I think, to consider. So, for instance, there is definitely value, for instance, when we compare experiences from the Caribbean with nations in the South Pacific, or whether you compare maybe experiences in Latin America with Southeast Asia. I could see that there might be some similarities. But I think in most cases, and I think that's also part of capacity building, it's kind of how you learn as a single economy, and how do you learn as a region, because we all have, let's say, our very particular trajectories of how the internet came to our nations, and how we started adopting new technologies one way or the other. And I just wanted to, when FinServe was talking at the one and only Internet Governance Forum that was hosted in the Pacific Island in Vanuatu, I think 2 years ago, the regional one, he said every country needs to kind of write up its own, let's say, history of how the internet came to the country and how it grew. And I think that's very important, kind of to take that perspective, because it is very much kind of a national learning path. So I'm not so sure whether interregional capacity building is as valuable and as productive as we sometimes want to think. And I think that ties to maybe the other point I wanted to bring in, because I think one thing is really missing in lots of our cyber capacity building work, and the people who are working in this space, and that's kind of that developmental expertise, that ability to talk with kind of potential recipients of support, to really articulate, define, and reassess assumptions of what is really required and what would make sense in their particular context. And that might mean that you are, that in the end, you take a completely different direction than what you would initially think would be appropriate. So that would be my other point. Developmental expertise, I think, is really lacking in this space.
Thanks, Bart. Falaki, can I just put you on the spot on that, since you work in a regional, a sub-regional organization that has a economic development, etc. focus? Yeah. Could you respond to what Bart just said?
Well, Bart and I, sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't agree. So I'm kind of in the middle with what he said. I kind of think there is room for interregional capacity building on one hand. On the other hand, I understand where Bart's coming from. What we are finding is that there has to be national buy-in and ownership and commitment. If that is not there, then we're sort of wasting our time. There's no point coming to do capacity building. So we need to make sure those three things are actually in place. We're also finding that, obviously, we know wealth builds a nation. If you've got money, if you've got the funds, you can do a lot of capacity building. We don't have that within the region. So what we're finding is that when we get donors or partners coming in, we have to assess their capacities and the resources they have to see if it can actually filter through and make a difference. I think a lot of donors are just dangling the carrot, and then they expect you to just take the bait. But as global south or developing countries, we need to do a little bit more to ensure that we're not just taking any carrot that's thrown at us. So I think in that respect, if you look at the traditional donors and the non-traditional donors, you find that quite a number of countries are moving towards the non-traditional donors because the requirements are less and they're less stringent, which sometimes might not be a good thing and sometimes might be a good thing. You know, you really have to see where each country is coming from. Like Bart was saying, obviously the economies of each different country is different. There are certain nuances in West Africa that we won't find in the Asian region. So that's why I think we need to talk a bit more, even if it's at the regional level, because the regional bodies understand what's going on in their member states. I can say from an ECOWAS perspective, our member states take what we say as fait accompli. So if we say, for example, the GFCE, which ECOWAS is a member of, if we say to our member states, please join the GFCE, there are resources available. Most of our member states will do it because they do take what we say as authority to a certain extent.
Thank you. I think that really helped give us a more nuanced picture, and I appreciate you jumping in like that. And that resonates with one of the comments we've received from one of the participants. We have Teresa from the Diplo Foundation, who has, of course, noted that in cross-regional capacity development efforts, there's support, making sure that it's neutral and unbiased, because a lot of times, as you say, there's carrots, there's strings, it comes with strings attached. And that's something we talked about in the OEWG. So I was just wondering if other people on the panel want to talk about, strings, no strings, how it works, and making sure that buy-in is there. Does somebody else want to jump in on that question?
I'd like to come in on that,
Please do.
Kirsten. You know, I had experiences earlier in my career when we were very successful in promoting teleeducation models and telemedicine models to many developing countries. Building on that experience, I would say a country like India that's been able to build very good platforms for payment platforms, e-commerce platforms, fintech platforms, online banking platforms at not a very great cost, would be happy to share that expertise with the other developing countries, provided there's an interest. So how this would fit into interregional is a question, because obviously the cultural contexts are different in different regions. But in some ways, these models that have been developed in developing countries may be more suitable for the global south. And I think we have a, sort of a special fund for Africa. So even the funding could come from that. And I think by and large, India does not attach conditions like, that only Indian firms should do the work, or that we want to bring in our own workers to be installed in that country. The interest is very much in training local people to take over and to keep it sustainable. So, I mean, I'm just throwing that in as an idea that, there is possibilities of this sort of cooperation as well.
All right. Liga, did you want to jump in on this one as well?
Well, I was thinking about your question, or the question posed, I think, on the Q&A about sort of the strings attached to any sort of capacity building. I think when we look at the UN processes, I think it's one approach that any capacity building we want to have also accompanied with respect for international law. And so building a foundation that, looking at the future, once capacity develops in a region, that this will not become a region that suddenly does not respect the applicability of international law and responsible behavior in cyberspace, as already identified in different UN GGEs from 2015 and prior. So how can we partner capacity building with norms is quite important from our side. I mean, we see that from a corporate responsibility perspective, we address cyber norms quite with some fervor, and we would like capacity building to go along the same lines. So how can we make that work? And how can we emphasize that responsible behavior plus capacity building is good for longer term development?
Right. Thank you for bringing in the linkage between capacity building and the responsible behavior framework that we have already in place at the international level. Does anybody else want to jump in on this? Because I think it's a nice segue to talk about trust. We have a question and also a comment in the Q&A about cross-border or global capacity building for cybersecurity and even internet governance. There's maybe a lingering, what the person says here is a lingering mindset of distrust across some regional or economic blocks. So how do we address this issue of trust and efforts to build trust in capacity building? We just talked a bit about the carrots and the sticks and not obligations, but the linkages or conditionality. But trust and legitimacy are really key criteria for successful capacity building, and not just capacity buildings in and of itself, but building those enduring, sustainable relationships that we believe are the foundations for success here. So in your view, are there existing regionally focused organizations or partnerships that are maybe underutilized or underleveraged that are trusted partners that have kind of inherent legitimacy in particular regions? We've talked a bit about sub-regional and regional organizations. Bart has mentioned the value of think tanks in Track 1.5 or Track 2 initiatives. And so first, within the region, are they underutilized? And also, how could we better leverage those sorts of resources in cross-regional sharing? So I'm going to throw that out to the whole panel. Maybe Folaki, would you like to start?
Thank you, Kirsten. One thing I would say is leadership is key. If you've got a good leader in place, well, leadership could mean across the board, and they have an understanding of what the issues were. Just piggybacking on what Liga said, when we're talking about the norms, the OEWG, the GG is in West Africa, for example, we're still talking about certs, we're talking about SOCs, we're talking about digital labs. So we're not quite at that level. So I think it's important that we start educating our leaders so that they know what needs to be done. And this is the time to actually start doing that. So we need to leverage on our relationships with the GFCEs, the EU, BATS organization, you name it. And I think if we start building those bridges and we use our regional bodies a bit more, because we've got more power in terms of trying to get our member states to actually come in as a group. So you can imagine if you take for ECOWAS, for example, you're talking about almost 400 million people. So it's easier to drill down on that level than going individually, a state by state. It's not going to work. And again, that way you're sort of killing 10 birds with one stone. So I think we need to look at that approach, and also face-to-face matters. Member states, countries, people, they want to talk to people they already know. So you need to build that trust. If Liga goes to, for example, Senegal, if nobody knows her in Senegal, she's not going to get anywhere. No, it's the reality as we know it. So even if Microsoft wants to build a relationship on the Paris Call Agreement, you have to have strong partnerships with all your regional bodies, and then they will take it through. That way, I think will be a more successful approach. We need to utilize our platforms such as the GFC. They're tried and tested. They have actually run initiatives in a number of countries, Senegal, Gambia, and those have worked. So we need to use all those kind of structures that are currently in place.
Mm-hmm. Mm. It's interesting that we're talking about both trust in kind of institutions and organizations, but also the personal trust and the relationships that get built up. And that's also part of the sustainability question, isn't it? And how much is personal, and maybe some of the challenges that the current pandemic and the lack of the ability to hop on a plane or go do a 3-day workshop or do what you need to do on the ground, how that has kind of set new challenges for developing new relationships. It's much easier to maintain relationships that already exist in a digital environment than it is perhaps to establish new ones. Other panelists on this question of trust and yes, Lata and then Liga.
I just wanted to actually talk about another issue. You know, when you're talking about capacity building, you're talking about the need to build infrastructure, you know, to connect the country. You're talking about the need to master technologies, particularly the advanced technologies that Faluke spoke about, you know. But I think the policy issues are also very, very important, you know, because this idea of educating the political leadership to take the right decisions, the idea of building capacity on policy issues is very important. A lot of people just say data is the new oil, and they really don't know what they're saying. You know, I mean, it's just a catchphrase. The real issues, whether it's data governance, data protection, data privacy, you know, water sensitive personal data. You know, you need to go into these things in a little more depth to be able to talk with any authority. And the same is true of internet governance. The same is true of norms, you know, the various efforts going on to build norms around the world. So I would say there's a need to build all the three capacities. And I think that if partners come forward with very concrete examples of how they can help with each of these areas or some of these areas, that in itself will build trust, because you'd realize that you're not just saying, give me a contract to build something, right? You're actually saying, I want you to become self-reliant, and I want to teach you how to master each of these areas. So I think that's a great trust building exercise.
Thank you, Lata. Liga.
Yeah, I wanted to speak from the experience of Europe on this trust building issue, because of course we do have very close government cooperation, but trust is something that is always something that has to be constantly readdressed. Europe did this through legislation, which was quite controversial, to have sort of a forced cooperation and trust building through the NIS cooperation group and the CSIRT network that was under the NIS directive adopted a few years ago. So in my experience, sitting on the side of government at that point, it was quite controversial to force all countries to send one participant to discuss strategic issues in cybersecurity, because it was a mandatory cooperation. And that process is still underway. But over the course of years, if you make people meet 3 times a year and look at each other and, discuss their families over coffee, then they do build trust eventually, it turns out. But the important thing is to keep the same people in the room over the course of a few years. And how do you do that? Because that's very difficult. And in the situation of COVID, this is even worse, because to talk to people through the computer, I mean, we're all kind of getting used to it, which is the case. But how can we take that sort of European best practice of really making people get in the same room and see if that works in other regions? So, I fully well realize what Falaki says. If I go to Senegal, nobody's going to listen to me, regardless of who I represent. So how do we build that kind of cooperation and sort of force the trust a little bit along the European example and see what works? I mean, there's FIRST, which joins certs from all over the world. That goes quite well, but that's also a closed community in one sense, where CSIRTs don't even want to talk to their counterparts on the sort of strategic government side as well. So within a government, you also need the strategic side talking to the technical side openly as well. So there's lots of layers that need to be addressed, but getting people in the same room is quite important, and that's. As soon as we get this COVID problem taken care of, maybe we can look at that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, Bart, I think you're the only one that hasn't come in on this yet.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm still expecting Microsoft to come up with a vaccine that will get us all traveling very soon. But without getting, maybe I'll just share an example of the point you raised earlier, Kirsten, and that's about, let's say, cyber capacity building and kind of the ongoing UN processes. And I wish it wasn't brought up in this conversation, but let me share one example of one project I'm running, which is supporting the member states of ASEAN, so the Southeast Asian Association of Nations, with the implementation of the UN cyber norms, which, whether you like it or not, or whether it's a fact or not, is still very much seen as kind of an agreement that's kind of being pushed towards these nations, and many countries are looking at these nations to kind of subscribe to it, and they've done that in public and in a public statement, kind of. But how do you kind of build a deeper level of comfort and awareness of what these actually mean in practice? So we set out a kind of a program which looked at, first of all, looking at what would be local knowledge partners, local think tanks in the region that could help us, and that we could kind of train up and help develop their own knowledge and skills in engaging with their government counterparts. But when we ran our training sessions and the workshops, it was not so much, let's say, us telling us what it was, but really trying to listen what would, for instance, the 11 UN norms mean for them in practice. And actually what we found, and hopefully in not too long, we will also be able to share some of that information, because we have kind of done that in confidence, is that in most countries you see practical examples of implementation of these norms, but they're not being seen or perceived or framed as such. So when Falak is talking about, let's say, third developments in Western Africa, and the same for, let's say, a larger part of Southeast Asia, that is, in fact, having these capabilities and having policies around these institutions is part of the implementation of some of the norms. And what we also say is that in the absence of a UN blueprint, which I don't think that will happen anytime soon or at all, I'm not sure whether we should want to either, but that also allows an opportunity for each nation to kind of develop its own interpretation of what an international agreement or like the UN norms means in their specific context. So actually, I can't judge that, of course, myself, but if I would judge myself, I think we have been pretty successful to the extent possible in creating a level of trust by engaging local partners, by being there for the long run, by delivering something concrete, but also by being very critical, let's say, about our own nations that we present, and that we don't have all the answers to all the questions. So I think this is an example of where sustainability and local ownership can work at a very practical and operational level, and where you build, let's say, greater awareness and a deeper sense of comfort with what's happening, let's say, at the global level. But because I think, despite what we believe, things are happening very quickly, especially when you talk about, let's say, the UN processes, unless you may be very deeply involved in it. But for most countries, it's still a very quickly evolving roadshow, which they find, I think, difficult and challenging to really follow and to really grasp.
Thanks, Bart. I think that helps round us out. I wanted to share with everyone a few of the comments and insights that have come from participants here. A colleague, Sylvia at the OSCE, says she agrees a lot with what the panelists have said, but following on Bart's remark that interregional capacity building is maybe not as productive as we'd like to hope it would be. And Folake's reply, she says she would add that exchange between regional organizations can be fruitful, not with the aim to copy from one to another, but to exchange best practice, specific practices, and see what can be done for a specific sub or a specific region. And a forum for regular exchange would be valuable. That's certainly something that I know that Sylvia and I have talked about in the past, about how do we, even in informal ways, help regional and sub-regional organizations connect more amongst themselves to exchange their experiences. Another person has come in and said personal relationships and personal trust is what expands into trust between nations and regions, which echoes some of the things that have been said on the panel. We have a comment that says, my personal experience is a minimum of 3 meetings. In the 3rd meeting, something changes. There you go. That's an endorsement of the European 3 meetings. Even between police, CSIRT, and regulators, it's all about learning positions and if and where there are common goals. And I've seen some enlightening experiences there. So 3 is the magic number, apparently, for breakthroughs. And this is from a Dutch colleague representing at this IGF and part of the Dynamic Coalition on Internet Standards, Security, and Safety. We have another comment that says she agrees strongly with Falaki's point about building capacity through and of regional institutions. So it seems like we have a lot of interest and agreement on both the personal side, the importance of regional actors as being trusted partners that are probably underutilized, and they themselves need their own capacity to be built and enlarged, and that is perhaps a force multiplier that we could do more on. I'm conscious of the time, and I think this is a great discussion. I wanted to dig down into this question of sustainability. I think we've been kind of skirting around it, and by emphasizing both the personal relationships are being important, but people move on, people retire, people move in and out of positions. So how do we balance that personal connection, which is important, with sustained institutional trust and legitimacy? How does that work? Does it have to start with the personal and then that kind of colors institutional relationships? Is there some sort of transfer that happens, or we can't always rely on personal connections? So I just was wondering if the panelists could quickly, if anybody wants to tackle that one.
I'd like to come in on that, Kirsten. You know, when I was in government, it was very important to build that personal trust. Now, I don't know whether the magic number is 2 or 3 or 4, it could be different. But yes, because your first meeting is essentially to state your positions. It's to make the other person aware of where you're coming from. And in subsequent meetings, you take that for granted and then start seeing what are the things you can agree upon. And certainly by the time you've had 3 or more meetings, trust is built. And as far as changing the personal relationship to an institutional relationship, I would talk about, very briefly about my experiences as a diplomat. You move on in 3 years, but certain relationships have been built. What do? You leave a handing over note for your successor, saying, these are the useful contacts, these are the institutions it's very good to cooperate with. And I think a wise successor would actually take note of that and build on that. But it is still somewhat personal because it depends on how much each person wants their successor to succeed. And it's not always the case. So I would say that sustainability, this is very important. Keep the same personal relationships going where possible. And where it's not, you create a mechanism where you say, this institution is worth cooperating with, no matter who's in that one and who's in your own institution.
So starting with
and
the
that's
personal.
Sustainable.
Yeah, starting with the personal and
starting with the personal
allows creation of the institutional. We only have 3 more minutes, colleagues, and I feel like we could continue on this for some time. And this is such a great topic. I think in the remaining 3 minutes, I'd like to ask you all to just, in lieu of closing remarks or final words, just before we wrap up, I'd like to ask each of you, imagine we're at IGF 2021. Thank you for giving us the background there, Liga, for us to look at. We're all imagining. And we're reflecting on interregional capacity building a year on. And Liga might be joining us from Senegal at that time, I'm not sure. But regardless, particularly taking into account the challenges of capacity building during the pandemic, which unfortunately seems to be with us into next year, certainly. And also that sense of urgency, which has been amplified during this time for all of us. So a year from now, what's the one thing you'd be looking back and saying in your role where you are now, what would you have been most pleased to see changed in the past 12 months on interregional capacity building? What would you have liked to achieve that's realistic under the current circumstances and environment? Folaki, could you
For me, I would say I would really hope that the countries in West Africa are moving slightly into talking about CBMs and norms that would actually encourage a more responsible behavior, because right now the conversations are still all around the technical side of cyber. So for me, I think we need to start talking more about the diplomacy side of cyber, because I think that's important and they go hand in hand.
Okay, that's a good priority for the next year. Bart?
Yep, two things. I would be very happy that in a year from now we can look back and talk about a very dynamic GFCE Pacific Hub that's just been announced a couple of weeks ago, where we're looking at establishing a regional kind of center of expertise or an operational hub that can support countries, let's say, with a global headquarters back in Europe, but with a local hub in the South Pacific region. So I'm very much looking forward to how that is developing. And secondly, which is kind of echoing, I think, for Laka's point, and finally we're back on the same page again. I would be very content when we see more countries and more organizations feeling comfortable with expressing their views and their positions on a whole range of kind of cyber security, cyber development, ICT development issues than we see currently.
That's a good metric of success. Lata, in less than a minute, what's your wish for 2021?
I want to see a universally trusted global agency emerge on cyber capacity building. All
right, that's sounds like an excellent idea. What about you, Liga? Final word.
I'd like that institution to be multi-stakeholder so that Microsoft can participate. But I also, in 1 year, I'd like to be standing at this building and also talking to new partners from different regions that I have not met before and working on building that trust that's necessary in this multi-stakeholder environment to look at how we can address this cross-regional cooperation a bit better.
So that first meeting out of 3 next year. Okay. And with that, I'd like to thank our fabulous panelists. I'm sure you found this conversation as stimulating and thought-provoking as I have. I think we have a lot to do in this area. And I wish all of you a continued and productive, interesting discussion at IGF 2020. So thank you to the organizers, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you this morning / evening / afternoon, depending on wherever you are. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.